Hello and welcome to the spring of 2021 Whites release. We're going to be bringing out some really wonderful and exciting wines that are going to be a lot of fun to talk about. We are focused primarily on the 2020 vintage, which is what most of these wines are. There's only one exception to that rule, which is Chardonnay always comes out about a year later, so that's going to be a 2019. But the focus of the discussion for the most part will be the 2020 year. It was a really interesting year, and fortunately, amongst all the chaos of the 2020 year, the vineyard growing season actually went really quite well and was relatively easy to deal with. It followed kind of an interesting pattern. We started with a relatively rainy spring, nothing extreme, good vine growth, good healthy vines, really nice. Then we went into an extremely dry period that lasted much beyond what I think was normal, to where we actually started watering young vines that had been planted and started to see stress and yellowing in some of the older mature vines throughout the vineyard. Really more extreme than anything I've ever seen, and I think actually had some developmental shutdown or issues on the vines. That was followed by, in August, about a 3-week period of nonstop, really wet. And then the year rounded out after that with another pleasantly dry spell for the ripening window. Overall, these dry periods resulted in, I think, really nice concentration in the wines. The wet period in August had some implications on different blocks as to how well they could handle hanging later into the fall. Some of them, I think, suffered a little bit in the integrity of the skins from that pretty extreme and longer duration wet period. But the whites in general all fared really well. Now, the interesting thing overall about it, and I didn't realize this until I think after the fact, was I was perceiving in the wines higher acidity, so bright fresh tartness, and lower sugars at picking, which was resulting in lower alcohol and a little bit different balance than maybe that we're used to. Concentration was there, but I would have thought with the dry periods that the sugars would have been higher and maybe the acidity is a little bit lower. Turns out Virginia Tech put out a really nice report after the growing season summarizing it, and they look at some more analytical data than I usually do, part of which showed the actual heat unit accumulation over the course of the growing season. And without getting into sciencey numbers and what all that means, basically the year overall was a good bit cooler than a normal growing year. Now, we had one really warm phase, and I can't remember if that was July or if that was in August or when that was. There was a lot of brain fog working through 2020 and all the other issues. So there was one really warm window. Other than that, it was a really quite cool growing season. So when you get cool seasons, you get higher acidity, you get lower sugar, plus we had that really wet, plus we had some really extreme dries, and I think the vines just didn't develop as high of a sugar. So you see some of this in the reds, which are working their way through this beautifully in the cellar right now, but actually shows us really kind of a strong suit for a whites program, because you get that bright freshness, you get great flavor, nice concentration, a little bit lower alcohol. All the pieces come together actually really nicely, and so that's what I'm excited for the majority of these to bring to you. So we're going to focus on 5 wines that we're going to start going through one by one. We've got Shin Blanc, Rusan, Chardonnay, Traminette's a new one, and Rosé. So we'll start right at the beginning and move through them. All right, so I gotta get used to my camera and how this shows up. Shin Blanc. So Shin Blanc, I love the wine that we produce with our Shin Blanc, but it is a really small block. It was put in as basically a trial block to see if it would handle our conditions, because it grows really well in the hot region down in South Africa. Turns out it likes a dry hot, whereas Virginia is a warm, damp hot. So sometimes we struggle to get the fruit to hang as long as we would want before we have rot pressure set in. 2020, I think that actually went really quite pleasantly smooth without any real problems. The other issue that it has, though, is it doesn't really like the cold snaps that we get in the winter, and that causes some erratic and inconsistent crop yield off of them. So as much as I love the wine, it's only a half-acre block, and it's not something I'm planning on expanding because it has some significant challenges associated with it. But we'll keep what we got because it's wonderful. So it produces this stainless steel white, so it's bright, crisp, fresh, great varietal flavor to it, just crisp and delicate in its own way. After steel tank fermentation, I aged them around about 5 months in stainless steel barrels. That lets me stay on the lees, which is the yeast sediment, the cloudiness in the wine. That lets the wine develop more of the complexity and the rich texture and some flavor to it. So it's something you can only do for so long in a stainless steel barrel because it doesn't breathe. So it can be kind of like an anaerobic environment if you go too far. So it can stand there for a certain amount of time, then comes out and goes into the bottle. Really nice, served cold, crisp. Those of you that have had the Shin and like it, I think you're going to be really happy. This and a lot of these other wines are interesting in terms of how they match up with other years. They're somewhat reminiscent of 2017s that have all that concentration and flavor and brightness and not super high alcohol. They have also the bright acidity and freshness and fruit flavors that we found in 2018. 2019 was kind of the oddball because that was a different version of dry that just produced concentration with really high sugars at harvest, which gave us really high alcohol, and the wines had more of a hot feature, dry character to them, and diminished in terms of the acidity. So that was a little different balance. But I think the way that this vintage balance is almost ideal for what most of us are looking for in a white wine making program. So that's the Shin Blanc. Second one that we come to is Rusan. So Rusan is another small block. We have a half-acre cropping, and we've already expanded that. We've got about another 2/3 of an acre of vines that are really young in a spot that grows kind of slow. So it's going to take them a little while to really crank up their production from where it's at. But makes a fascinating wine that likes to ripen in the heat of Virginia. So again, it wasn't necessarily a hot vintage year in 2020, so this came in with a little bit lower sugar and thus lower alcohol than usual, but that's not an issue. It still has that like rich, creamy, fuller weighted characteristic that we find in Rusan. So it's steel fermented also, and then it goes into the neutral oak to age for the 5 months or so on the lees again before it goes into the bottle. It tends to develop a little bit more complex characteristics. Maybe you'll find a little butterscotch kind of a note to it, maybe kind of a nut flavor to it. Different features, but definitely richer textured, fuller characteristic in the Rusan. So that is something that we're increasing a little bit, but it still has its winter tenderness issues, so it still needs to be approached with a little bit of precaution, but something that I'm excited about and doing a little bit more of. Next one that we have on this flight is Chardonnay. So this, again, drops back a year to 2019. The Chardonnay program operates closer to the way that we operate red wines. So that means that this is still fermented in stainless steel and then goes into the neutral oak on the lees for about 10 months. And after bottling, will bottle age 6 months or whatever it is, until we start tasting them, and that is allowing them to develop more of that fuller, weighted, richer characteristic that we look for in like a bigger bodied white wine. So we get classic Chardonnay flavor to it, just that little note of buttery in the background, not new oak, it's a neutral oak, which I really like. So we've got the freshness with the fullness, great balance. It's grown over at the Seven Oaks Vineyard, which is the site over in Philemont. That's Mark and Madeline Skinner's vineyard. Absolutely amazing growers that we work with. I've used their vineyard exclusively since I think 2005, and super excited for the opportunity to do so. Great part of the Arterra team here. So if you love the Chardonnay, that's where it's being grown. At that same site also is the Cabernet Franc, if you're into that, and a good chunk of the Petit Verdot. And then we're planting a couple other things over there in the meantime. So we'll talk more about the Seven Oaks Vineyard another time. Next one I'm going to move on to is something new and different, and there can be a lot to talk about with this, and I'm going to try not to overly long-wind it. This is Traminette, and I'm really excited about it because I've worked with Traminette for a number of years in the past on like really small trial basis kind of thing. So this is the first Traminette that I've made. So this is what's called a French-American hybrid. So that's an American variety crossed with a French variety. I believe it's Gewürztraminer, but I'm not sure. And I think it's Saval, but I'm not sure. So check all that out before you quote any of that. But the point is that you get some attributes through these breeding programs, and it's not just here in the US that this is happening. There's some more advanced breeding programs going on through Italy and France and Germany and Eastern Europe, and they're breeding what you would call a domesticated vinifera, which vinifera domesticated is all the names you know, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, whatever. They're crossing those with vinifera wild types, so naturally occurring vines from that environment. So when you take these naturally occurring vines, whether they're the American stock originally or this other European stock, those are vines that have evolved and generated seed over time and have evolved genetics and handle the conditions. So we get two kind of big attributes in this. One is that these breeding programs are introducing greater winter hardiness, which is important because we're having more problems under climate change where winters are warmer, and then we have these extreme one-night dips in temperature that the vines just can't handle. So breeding some of this hardier stock really helps with the production consistency side of things. The other thing the hybrids are doing, whether it's a hybrid or that's the right word or not, doesn't matter, but they're modern breeding programs for vines. They are starting to shake up the genetic profile of the vines, because what's happened is the vines have stayed the exact same for hundreds of years, if not a good bit more than that, some of them, because we've always tried to select and plant the exact same thing, because we know what we want, we know how good it is, and so we have to have that same thing. So they did clonal propagation, which works great to produce the same thing, but the problem is the vine stayed a stagnant genetic profile and the diseases just kept evolving to take advantage of it, to where disease pressure has been up and up and up and up, which demands more focus on hand management and spraying and that kind of stuff. So this is a situation that has risen because of the stagnant profile, genetic profile of grapevines, and is being exacerbated by climate change, especially in an area like ours where we are seeing warmer and damper nighttime conditions, which really facilitates lots of growth of diseases in the vineyard. So the diseases are at advantage. These breeding programs, one, are working with naturally disease-resistant stock to introduce natural resistance into the vines, and just simply shaking up the genetic profile of the vines so that we can get back ahead a little bit of the advantage that the diseases have. So it's going to be an important thing for sustainability in the future, especially under climate change, that we start to learn and work with these modern breeding programs of vines to see what makes great wine, what we like, what the people like, and what we can kind of like build into the program as a little bit more of a reliable, sustainable aspect of, staying viable through the future. So Traminette is one of those. I'm really excited about it because it has this really great, like vividly floral aromatic to it. So that's why we put it kind of down the flight past the others, because I didn't want it to kind of throw off perception of the ones that came before it, because it is vivid in a really like pleasant, interesting way. Has some nice richness to it, great flavor. So what we did to make it a little bit more interesting, and we're playing with this and we'll continue to explore and see how it goes, is this was made, even though it doesn't really show up really dark, this was made according to what you would call an orange wine. So that means I started the fermentation and kept it on the skins for a portion of the fermentation. In this case, it was 9 days that it stayed on the skins. And that was through about a quarter to a third sugar depletion. So not to the very end of the fermentation where we'd be in a more severely alcohol extracting phase, but just to learn and see and keep the freshness and brightness into it, but build in complexity and flavor and volume and richness and more characteristics from the skins. 9 days on the skins. Really interesting. Again, it's not especially dark. So maybe you wouldn't even notice it, but I think it definitely adds to the depth and the characteristic and the interesting features of this wine. So starting to make orange wine, and I have another side aspect that I'll mention in a minute about that. But Traminette, I think, is a really exciting step for us. We've got other cool things going on that we'll fill you in more on later. So that fruit actually came from a vineyard up in Loudoun County, a really good grower named, I think it's Clyde Housel at Hiddencroft, and he had this available, and he's got great reputation for fruit quality. So checked in with him on how it was all being grown. Everything checked out. Fruit looked amazing, and really excited about that. And in the future, I'm sure we're going to plant some of it. But for right now, we're doing our best working with that, and really excited about it. All right, last one, 5th of 5 in the main flight here of release is 2020 Rosé. All right, so this one is interesting. We finally put on the back of some of these bottles, see if I can get in the picture right. There it is, the blend. So 76% Petit Verdot, 24% Cabernet Sauvignon. The Petit Verdot is from the Seven Oaks Vineyard. The Cabernet Sauvignon is from our site. They're both 24 hours skin contact to get that color, flavor out of the skins, and then pressed. And that gives you this lighter rosé color. And after that, it's made like a stainless steel white wine. Really interestingly, very similar flavor, characteristic, weight, and balance to the vintage that came before it, even though the grape lineup is different, but really pleasant, really refreshing, nice acidity to it, fullness, all those same good things. So that's going to be great coming up in the spring and the summer. So that's the main flight. Chenin, Rusan, Chardonnay, Traminette, Rosé. I've got two other things to mention. I'll do as quickly as possible that we brought out during the winter time to make winter more interesting, that we still have a little bit of. So hopefully if you get here in the first 1 or 2 weekends of club release, these will still be here for you to check out. In addition to the 2019 Chardonnay that's on this flight, we have, through the winter, we've had on the flight the first zero sulfite Chardonnay and the Amphora fermented Chardonnay. They were each only 24 cases, and they're already about half gone. So it's not going to be long, but if you get in soon, you could ask to try these also. So there it says at the bottom the same thing, 2019 Chardonnay, but the zero sulfite has the zero up here at the top indicating it, whereas the original wines all have the wine glass at the top. So this is made with, instead of steel fermented, this is barrel fermented and never moves. It's usually after you ferment, you move to leave like the heaviest gunk behind, and you take the lighter cloudy stuff with you, and that's the lees that we age on. This instead, with no sulfite ever added to it, stays with that heavier sediment that acts as an antioxidant. It's opened as little as possible, so minimum monitoring to it. It did get stirred just a couple times. Anytime it's opened or immediately blowing nitrogen into the opening so that it's not introducing oxygen to it, and it comes straight out of that barrel right into the bottle. 24 cases out of one barrel. We're ramping this up to what's called a punch-in, which is basically a double-sized barrel, a 500-liter barrel, so we can take this up to 50 cases. A little bit more tint to it. It's not filtered. Great, interesting, complex flavors to it. Being barrel fermented instead of steel, it's more softer, rounder. Introduces a different set of characteristics from the lees aging as an antioxidant as opposed to the bright fresh that can sometimes come with that sulfite type program. The other one, as long as it lasts, and it won't be that long, is 2019 Chardonnay. See, 2019 Chardonnay in Amphora. So, see, I'm having a hard time with my camera. So it's got Amphora up here. So this one was fermented in the Amphora on the skins for 2 weeks, and then because we only have the one Amphora at the time, it was pressed and then aged out in a neutral oak barrel for 5 months and then bottled. So this, in addition to the thermodynamics of the clay vessel, the clay amphora is kind of similar thermodynamics to a barrel fermentation, has a rounder, softer, richer characteristic to it. It also has the extraction from the skins. So this was 2 full weeks on the skins until it was dry, done fermenting, and then pressed. So you get some more extraction from the skins with this process. So it's an orange wine or an amber wine. Not as dark as some of the like the Georgian wines that are like 6 to 9 months on the skins and different grape varieties. So it's still got a little bit of a lightness to it. Again, bottled unfiltered, so there's some cloudiness to it, but great complexity to it. I think really interesting. My recommendation on both the zero sulfite and the amphora, if you do try them, is they've got their sediment collected at the bottom. I really encourage you to give it a little bit of a shake up before you open it, so that that cloudiness is evenly distributed, because it's an amazingly interesting attribute to the wine. That sediment that's in there is bringing more flavors and characteristics. Whereas if you don't do that, your first pour from the top will seem kind of thinner and lighter. And then once you get a lot of the sediment mixed in right at the bottom, it's going to be almost like too much, too thick. When it's incorporated like this is the way it was when it was originally bottled, and as far as I'm concerned is best. So the Chardonnays I really like cool, not cold. They age really well, and they develop the same kind of like as reds with like breathing and so forth. So I'll be around for whites release the first 3 weekends of April, much as I can, talking to everybody that wants to say hi and have questions and talk about these wines. Otherwise, they'll be on the website for ordering, and we'll hopefully see you sometime. So really excited about these 2020 vintage wines, the 2019 Chardonnay, and fingers crossed for off to a good start here in 2021. Thanks. See you soon.